All right, so we are in Luke chapter 6 today. If you would open with me to Luke chapter 6. And if you remember last time, we kind of left off in the middle of concluding a thought, but the section we were in is really easily categorized. It's in that same section where he was talking about that parable. You can't put in old wineskins new wine, it's going to burst. Vice versa. And so the new is for the new, the old is for the old. And often we think of Old and New Testaments, but the fact is Luke is going on and explaining what Jesus meant by that parable. Good Bible study tip or tactic or method, whatever you want to call it, we can use is oftentimes the Bible in that particular book will explain itself. And sometimes it takes us a while to see it, reread it, but sometimes you just read on and keep reading and you're going to see the overall picture. And the first one we saw was in the Sabbath rule. If you remember, that was at the beginning of chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. But now we're just seeing that teaching in that parable play out. And the first one was in the Sabbath. They're accusing his disciples of breaking Sabbath by plucking those heads of grain. Now, I'll let you guys answer, was that breaking the Sabbath according to the law of Moses? No, what was the commandment in the old law regarding the Sabbath? 6 days. Yeah, and 7 days shall rest. So it's talking about those days of work, right? Well, no one would hardly call plucking a head of grain work, but they, probably because their history and Israel's past, they made all these laws to maybe protect, the following and faithfulness to the law, but they went overboard, right? They added all these commentaries and they made those commentaries equal with God's own word. That's a good lesson for us today. We know what God's word is when we read it, and we can stand by that. But there's other areas where we may be giving our opinion about principles, but sometimes people regard, because this commentary says it, we're going to go along with this school of thought. And we have to be careful of that. We have to call law what God has called law and leave as opinion or speculation the rest of what man has to say about it. But the second one, we saw with the Sabbath, and again, when he brings up David, he's saying David did what was unlawful. He's not excusing what David did there in verse 3. He says David did what was unlawful. But his point is, his disciples did not break the Sabbath, but they are criticizing them, and they don't call attention to someone who actually did break the Sabbath. But his third thing is he's the Lord of the Sabbath. And if they're not going to accept that, they're going to have a problem. It's right there in verse 5, it's a divine claim. So many times, and we may have said this before, we state the Gospel of John. John talks about how Jesus is God. He's divinity. He's from the Father. And sometimes people make it like that. The synoptic gospels, that word refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that you don't really find a whole lot about divinity. But that's not true. This claim that he is Lord of the Sabbath, the Son of Man referring to himself, is definitely him saying, it's a divine claim. The Sabbath was the Lord's of the Old Testament. He's not only claiming to generally be God, he's claiming to be that Lord who rested on the seventh day, and the Sabbath belonged to him. But the second occasion was a man with a withered hand. He healed this man's hand. You join us, it's Luke chapter 6, and we're just reviewing this beginning section here. But is it better to hurt life or to save it? Is it better to do harm? To save life or to destroy it? There you see in verse 9. And the fact is, they said another law they came up with. Well, if you heal someone, it has to be because their life is on the line. And whatever work you do on them, it basically has to be only to the degree that they don't die that day. Well, that's another law. Where does this come from? You read the Mishnah, it was their commentaries on all sorts of these things, and these were just laws that they added. There was the law of Moses, and then there was what the rabbis, the teachers, had commented about those laws. But because there were these teachers, they began to be regarded as almost up there with the law. And so, but no matter how respected a teacher is or how much knowledge someone may have, we have to separate man's word from God's word. And they failed to do that. And so we can almost see where Luke is going and where Jesus is going in this gospel. We can see why there was a need among the Jewish people for the Lord to come, because everything was way out of place. The religious were overly binding. I like to say it this way, they were making it harder to enter the kingdom than what it was. Struggles are already difficult enough. It's not necessary for us to make it more hard for someone coming from a life of sin to get to heaven. And the fact is, those struggles are hard enough, but Jesus can help people through that. But the religious leaders, they were out of place. The sinners were out of place because perhaps many of them, losing hope, had just settled in their lifestyles and they were far away from God. And now Jesus is on the scene and he has to restore things. He has to reconcile, bring people back to God. And he's going to do this, number one, through this message that he's preaching, then through the works that he does. Ultimately, that will be accomplished on the cross. But so far, the people are led astray. Later you'll see Jesus makes the comment, he looked at them as sheep without a shepherd. And so we're seeing these things early on, the setting that this happened. But he withdraws in verse 12. He goes on out to the mountain to pray, and he continued in prayer to God all night, there in verse 12. So it's important, we left off on this note, that when we're doing work, that's great, it's what we need to do, and it is beneficial to us. But there's a difference in the service we do and the personal time we spend with God. And we have to have that. We may have our responsibility in things we're doing, but they're not an end in itself. In other words, it's not like it's this picture where, God gave us this work to do and we're just doing it for the sake of doing work. Well, what's the purpose? We do the work because God has told us it's a priority. But in the end, the whole reason we're doing it is why? Because each and every one of us, we want answers from God, guidance from God. We want a close relationship with Him. But sometimes we can get so wrapped up in responsibility, we can forget that that's what it was all about. That's what the whole thing's about. And sometimes we can put our relationship with Him on the back burner because we get so busy. And sometimes it's for His work. But the point of doing all of that is for ourselves and for others to get closer to God and receive His divine guidance and spend that time in that relationship. But Jesus understands this, and so He's not, we talk about it would have been the perfect time to rest because He's tired, or I need to eat, or I need to do this, I need to take a day. Jesus didn't do that. He said, if I'm weakened in the flesh right now, that gives me more reason than ever. What I don't need is physical help. What I need is prayer to God, because if I'm weak, there's a danger there. Now, I'm not saying that's what he was saying, but you can see that mindset that when the flesh is weak, we have to go to the Spirit. Sometimes your body needs rest, and it's just that simple. And your body's going to eventually get rest one way or the other. But we can't just focus on the physical sometimes, and we have to see that sometimes when we're tired, sometimes when we've been busy, and we're feeling overwhelmed, what we really, really need is not sleep, it's not food. It's that alone time with God on the things that matter. And our body's going to be pulling the other way, like, no, you don't want to do that. You want to go, the bed's over there. Go lay down real quick. But we have to sometimes say, no, this is what the flesh wants me to do, but I haven't fed my spirit. I haven't cherished and spent time in prayer, in the Word, in that relationship, and I can't neglect it. So now he's getting down. That's important because now we're getting down to Jesus' ministry. So he understands these things are important. We have seen earlier, other times he has gone in prayer to God as well. This is something he understood throughout his ministry. And now he's getting down to the ministry because he's going to call his apostles, who will be the apostles. Right now he's just calling his disciples. And so it says, verse 13, when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. That word apostles is witnesses, and each and every one of them had witnessed the Christ. They had been with him, eating meals with him, walking with him, going about the ministry with him, learning from him. They got to witness all those parables firsthand. All those teachings, how amazing that would have been to have heard how he did it in person. But apostles, they witnessed him. Paul was an apostle because on some special level, he had Jesus revealed to him. I think the problem is so many times, and we've gone there before to discuss it in passing, but so many times when we think of Paul, we use the words in our head or to other people, he saw a vision. But the Bible actually doesn't say that when you read those scriptures. It says he was on the journey, he was on his journey, and he heard a voice calling to him. And then it goes on to explain in the best way, in human terms it can, how the Lord spoke to him. Other places, Paul just says that God revealed his Son to him. And he says that the Lord Jesus was gracious to him by revealing himself to Paul. Every sense we get of that is this was a special, not just a dream, not a vision necessarily. Even many visions of the prophets were miraculous, but this was, he was walking on a physical road and he witnessed something special with the Lord. He could call himself an apostle. If we did a detailed study on that, which we could do at other times, it may very well be the way Paul talks about his gospel and the gospel that was revealed to him. In some way, the Lord had revealed his gospel, his story directly to Paul. And so just as the others had a first-hand account of the gospel because they lived it, they were with Jesus through those 3 years, that Paul had received a direct gospel, which is that same one, but directly from the Lord. An apostle was a witness. Now, other places in the New Testament, the word apostle is used because it's the word witness, it's just used as he's a witness. But when the word apostles is used referring to the special group, the 12, it's always referring to them and their special task. You know, the word witness was apostle in their language. So you'll see that come up other times in the New Testament because that's what the word is. But this is used in a special way referring to this group. But another thing we see is he had a group of disciples. We see this in John. It says the disciples left, but then when he was teaching about the flesh and the blood and what it meant, and they said, this is a hard saying, and the disciples left, but then he turns to the 12 in John chapter 6, and he says, will you also leave? And they said, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. So there's a larger group of disciples, and then there's the 12, and then there's a special group within that 12, James, John, Peter. So very important to understand, because as we go through the gospel, we have to have this distinction in our head. Otherwise, some parts may be confusing. There's a bigger group, there's a large crowd following him. and then there's this group that he has chosen for a special task. So it says, he named apostles, Simon, verse 14, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So, just kind of like, not that this is the most important fact, but fun fact. So it wasn't Simon Peter. His name was Simon. He was called Peter. So that's how we understand that. Jesus called him Peter, which meant rock. And so, like, oftentimes God, like, for instance, he changed Abraham's name to Abraham. There's other places where he changed people's names, and he says, now you shall be called this. He changed Jacob's name to Israel, which means he who struggles with God. So oftentimes when the Lord changes someone's name, he has a special task for them. And he, even though Peter at this point, he's just a fisherman, you know, he knows about nets and fish and boats and that sort of thing, but he changes his name to Rock. And it's kind of a great encouragement that we know is true because, well, we're Christians and we weren't saved at some point, and God sees us for who we will become, not for who we currently are. If he saw us for who we currently are, well, where can we go? What could be done? But he sees us for who we will become. Maybe more specifically, what Jesus can do with us and what he can accomplish if he's able to work on us and with us. And he calls Simon Rock. Verse 15, there was also another Simon who was called the Zealot. Now, zealots, this is a little history, but it's an important one to understanding the New Testament especially, and what's going on in many places. Because we're going to take this book and then eventually make our way to Acts so that we can have a good grasp of the New Testament and the teachings of the church and how it all took place. And we got to understand this one thing, a little thing about history. You have Rome, who eventually, well, first, for a very small period of time, the Jews achieved independence from the Greeks. That was short-lived because then the Romans came along and took over everybody. And the Jewish people, based on those promises in the Old Testament, had thought, we're going to be this great nation, and God is going to send the Messiah, and we're going to be at peace. And they were thinking national freedom and national dominance. They were very confused when the Romans had stayed in power. And those who rejected Jesus must have thought, maybe the Messiah is going to come, or he's going to come back, and we're going to still see those promises made and see God's kingdom on earth. This was so ingrained in them, we will even see it with the apostles. After the ministry is over and Jesus has been crucified, if you read Acts, the first chapter, even after all that and all that teaching, they say, Lord, is this the time that all things will be restored? It was so ingrained that they were almost sure that plan was here on earth. They're going to see that glory of the Messiah revealed in Israel. They didn't see there was a deeper, God had something else in mind with those promises than what they interpreted them as. And so zealots came on the scene because Rome's in power. The Jewish people interpreted those promises a different way, that they were physical, that they were national. And so what the zealots said is, well, we're going to put a band together, a group, and we're going to try and, well, overthrow Rome ourselves. Not as a form of gathering an army, but these were kind of like, the closest thing we could describe them as would be assassins in our regular language of what we know of. And it's because there's a difference between assassins and zealots. But zealots, they were this idea of, well, their thinking was probably like, well, we're God's people and Rome's in power and we haven't seen anything happen, so maybe what we're supposed to do is try and take it from Rome and take it into our own hands. Now that's important because you have a zealot who hates tax collectors. Because a tax collector was collecting taxes from his own poor people for Rome, working with them, getting paid for them, and it was kind of like they were betraying their own people. These aren't my words, I'm just saying this is how they were viewed. They were kind of selling out their own people, whether it was the legal custom or not. The way they saw it was that they would do that for a profit, for more comfortable living. And here you have Matthew, a tax collector, and you have Simon, a zealot, and Jesus calls them to be in that special group. You have a bigger following of disciples, and so it could have played out where it's like you have some zealots who wanted to follow Jesus and you had some tax collectors. That might be more understandable, but it's interesting that Jesus said, I'm going to call a zealot and I'm going to call a tax collector and I'm going to put them both in my crowd of 12. It's amazing how the mind of God works and what the Lord can do. And I don't know if sometimes we speculate and say, oh, they must have had problems, we don't know if that was the case, or maybe they understood some of the Lord's teaching and it was understood that they need to be united with Christ. We don't know how it played out, but it's interesting to me how you can get a tax collector and a zealot on the same page to work together. And so even before the church is established, we can see the power that Christ has for people. And if that doesn't give us encouragement to be united and get along based on truth, not based on, just let's ignore things. No, based on truth, being united in the Word, but that is possible. And we can be on totally different pages to start with. But we have something that unites us, which is Christ. Well, that gives us a lot of hope. So he points this 12 because now he wants to get his ministry going. And so, verse 17, he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. So all they had to do was touch him. And it's amazing, you got a multitude trying to do this, and that's all they had to do. It's evident to me, sometimes we get a picture of, Jesus did a couple miracles, and a lot of people didn't believe, but some people had enough that they decided this is someone who has come from God and let's follow him. But that's not, I believe that's not what the accurate picture we see. It's because sections like this tell us that there would be no question. If you have this man, and what has he done? He's healed a leper. He's cast out these life-threatening diseases. He's healed someone and cured him who had a withered hand. Now everyone's coming to him, and all they have to do is touch him. Again, this is not just a group. Multitude doesn't mean like 5 or 6 people. This is a massive crowd. That's what multitude means. And everyone with something who is touching him is having that particular thing cured. And it's going to be different for everyone. One of them might have leprosy. One of them might be paralyzed. One of them might be sick. One of them might have some kind of medical problem. And no matter what that issue is, they're touching them and they're being healed. So I think a more accurate picture is it was obvious to everybody. This was not like some magician doing magic tricks and deceiving people. It was obvious to everybody that Jesus was from God. And it was more a picture like the man says in John, nobody could do these things unless he was from God. And those ones who disbelieved, it was more like the evidence was staring at them and they just didn't want to believe. So they disbelieved. We're here in Luke chapter 6. And so the real picture you get is, like John says, there were some people who in secret wanted to be his disciples for fear of the religious leaders. It was more a picture of, you had these stubborn people who wanted to reject him, and some people were in fear, but everybody really knew who he was. And everybody, I don't want to just categorize everyone, but I would say most people, by seeing all of these things, would know this has to be someone who is from God in one way or another. And the second thing is, when they saw the crucifixion, that didn't fit the plan of God that they had interpreted. They believed the Messiah was going to be this person who would, it was going to be a national thing, and he was going to rule, and they were going to see that glory on earth. And when Jesus went to the cross, that's when they lost their faith. But as far as the miracles, the picture we get in these Gospels is that everybody in Israel knew these things were happening. You have it recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, other places. You have the precise locations and cities that these miracles happened in. And every single writing in history we read, we don't have any sense that anybody was like, I've never heard of this. I've never heard of these miracles of Jesus happening. Every single document we have points to the fact that everyone was aware of this miracle worker. And by miracles, again, not magic tricks, healing someone who had been disabled since birth, blind, deaf, and everybody knew they had these problems. Leprosy. And you don't have any hint in history that it didn't happen, or that anybody never heard of it or was surprised. It's like all the documents you read, everyone just knows. Everyone knows it happened and accepts it. And that, although we don't see miraculous things happen in our day and age, that should be enough for us, because we know people aren't ignorant. Today, a lot of people try and make ancient people like they were just gullible and people accepted things. No, the Greeks, following philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they didn't want to accept anything because they came out of the pantheon where everyone was worshiping Zeus and Poseidon, and they wanted to be these educated type people and, very philosophical. And the fact is, a lot of these people, they wouldn't have just accepted things. They wouldn't have accepted a lot of these books as coming from God just because someone told them. If someone came back and said, I'll use Adam as an example. What if I came and I said, you're not going to believe this, but, Adam, he passed away on Thursday, but on Saturday, he came back to life. Who's going to believe me? Anyone? No one, right? It was the fact that the tomb was empty. But what if I said, go look, the grave's empty? You still going to believe me? No, because someone could have taken the body. I could have been staging something. But everyone said, we saw him. We saw these things happen. Why would you believe that unless you had a good reason to? But every evidence in history we have is that everyone, with the exception of the people who were against the Christian message, everyone who saw the evidence accepted it, and they turned to Christianity, and it spread rapidly. But when we read things like this, we have the specific locations that this happened, and it seems like common knowledge to Israel. In fact, we're kind of going on a tangent, but I think it's an important one. And we'll get there at the end, but turn to Luke chapter 24. Hold your spot here. Because in Luke chapter 24, there's an important statement on the road to Emmaus. This is after Jesus has been raised from the dead. And look at verse 18 of Luke chapter 24. And it says, "Then one of them named Cleopas answered him, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?' And he said to them, 'What things?' And they said to him, 'Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel.' Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." You see, what it tells us is this. This was not a surprise to anybody. And in fact, this message being taken to the Greeks and people who were not just Jews, it was common knowledge. I mean, the Roman politicians, they had a conversation that says this superstition had arose amongst the Jews, obviously talking about the resurrection. And it's historical. And when we go back here to Luke 6, these miracles that took place, it's of the same thing. They had specific locations, and we have to read these as something that it became common knowledge. It became something that people were familiar with. Those who did not accept that Christ was doing these things, they didn't deny that it was happening. They just were trying to find some alternative explanation because they didn't necessarily like a lot of the things that Jesus was teaching. But why? Because it goes back to that parable. They were used to the traditions. They were used to how they were raised or what they were taught or what the rabbi said. You know, they were used to the traditions that they were used to. And Jesus said, you pour new wine into an old wineskin, it's going to burst because they say the old wine is better. Many people will and did reject that message for the sole fact that it's not what they were used to. It's not what they were used to, and with that, the teaching that if it's rejected, it's going to be a stumbling block to them. Meaning, if you're rejecting Christ, you have everything on the line. It's not just, and so that wineskin is going to burst. But they didn't want to accept it because what about everyone they knew? What about everything they've been taught? And they'd rather stick with what they were used to. And we may have that same danger today. But now, what we're about to get into in verse 20 and following is really a sermon. And let's see what we have. Okay, we got just a couple minutes. So, this will be a section of teachings that Jesus gave. And you will notice that it is very similar to Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mountain. But there's one difference here. It says in verse 17 of Luke chapter 6 that he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a multitude of people. And then we talk about how he was doing that. They had a variety of different illnesses. They were just touching him and it was healing them, right? Who've been leprosy, paralysis, sickness, anything. But all they had to do was touch him. And whatever that thing was, they were being healed of it. But here he came down on a level place. And in Matthew you have Sermon on the Mountain where he was in that mountainous region teaching them. Now how do we explain this? Well, some have suggested that, and I think this is true, that oftentimes Jesus teaching to many people throughout the region, he would say a lot of the same things to different people because different people had to hear that same message. So perhaps this is a different occasion where this happened. I definitely think that happened. Another thing is, hey, welcome. Another thing is that when we read the Sermon on the Mountain, why you see some of the wording that's differently here, we're not looking at the whole word for word sermon. We're looking at those ideas in concise form and what they said. But the real sermon would have lasted hours. It would have lasted a very long time. Now, both of those things are true, but I don't believe what we're looking at is actually a different occasion. I think this is describing the same thing, the Sermon on the Mountain. How would we describe verse 17? He came down with them and stood on a level place. Well, Matthew primarily written to the Jewish audience. For example, he's talking about the Ten Commandments in Matthew. And he assumes that they're familiar with the Ten Commandments and a lot of those customs that the Jewish people had. So, naturally, the people in Israel would have been familiar with the geography. So when we're talking about the mountains, take for example, for those of you who have been in the foothills like Angels Camp, Copperopolis, Valley Springs, you kind of know that area because you've been around it. So if I describe the highways and this sorts of thing, you're going to know what I'm talking about. And so Sermon on the Mountain, they may have in mind the mountains, but a lot of times when we read the Bible, we think of it in our terms, and we don't think of the geography in their day. Well, if I talk about, a plain, a flat land, up in, what's that, the one everyone goes camping at, Murphy's, right? Does that mean I'm talking about a flat plain? No, it's in the mountains still, but I'm describing an area over there, right? Over here, what he's saying is, it was still a mountainous area, but he came down, he was higher up on the mountain, but he came further down and stood on a level place so that he could speak to the crowds. So it's not like they're saying different things or that it needs to be a different occasion. What we're seeing here is it's not an exhaustive sermon. This is generally what Jesus preached. In person, it would have been much longer. And Luke is kind of giving the concise form. Matthew is giving the longer form of the sermon. But right here, he's still in the mountainous area. He just came down, it's still the mountains, and he stood on a level place so that he could preach to them. And that's really, when you see that that's what's going on here, there's no confusion between Matthew and Luke. But now, when we pick up next time, we're going to get into that sermon. We're going to see the things that Luke chooses to focus on in that sermon and why it matters to us. The teachings of Jesus that will change our life. And so that's probably a good place to stop, and we'll be able to pick that up in next week's class. Any closing comments anyone wants to make before we end? All right, then we'll have a break before our worship service, and we'll pick up next week, still here in Luke chapter 6.